Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, downloading, and subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm 12 Kyle. Check this out. On this podcast, I'll do something a little different. I normally don't talk about current stuff or things that are kind of in the now, but on this podcast, I'm going to switch it up a little bit. I'm going to do a year-end review on some of the podcasts that I've heard, some of my favorites, and also give you some insight on some of the podcasts that I did with some of my friends this past year. So sit back, relax. I'll drop the theme music and we'll get the podcast jumping. Let's get it. Welcome back. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm talking about what's in your ears. What podcasts were really intriguing and dope this past year? Full disclosure, I listened to quite a few podcasts. I live in Atlanta, so if you're familiar with the city of Atlanta, it means that, there's a lot of traffic. So I'm sitting in a lot of traffic. So when I'm in traffic, I have a lot of time on my hands to, in my commute back and forth to work, got a lot of time to listen to podcasts. Not to mention when I get in my office, I do the same. So I'm not really, bothered per se at work. So I can listen to podcasts. So I spent quite a bit of time listening to podcasts. And as I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to tell you about some of the favorites, some of the ones that I like, some of the new ones that I picked up this year, and then tell you a little bit about some of the ones where I had collaborations on. I guess where I probably should start would be and these are in no particular order, probably for me, just on a personal note, the best podcast that I heard all year was Atlanta Monster. If you're not familiar with it, Atlanta Monster dealt with the case of Wayne Williams. Wayne Williams is the convicted serial killer who killed or was believed to have killed, I think, over 30 plus black kids in Atlanta in the early 80s. Wayne Williams was, to my surprise, convicted of killing 2 adults, and that's why he is now in prison for life. And so when I listened to this podcast, it was a series, and I think it was, maybe 14 or 15 episodes. I was a bit apprehensive about listening to it, to be honest, initially, because I remember being a child in the 80s. And I remember hearing about Wayne Williams. Now, I did not grow up in Atlanta. I didn't move to Atlanta until 1997. But given the fact that I lived in South Carolina, Wayne Williams was the modern day boogeyman. And it was crazy to hear these stories and hear this case. And throughout this podcast, you actually hear from Wayne Williams. And I'm not going to spoil the podcast because it's ongoing. I think they're still providing updates periodically, but for the most part, the podcast is closed out. But it's extremely intriguing. Honestly, there were parts of the podcast that was very difficult to listen to because you could hear the pain and the agony of some of the people who whose loved ones were killed. And honestly, in the black community, particularly in the black community here in Atlanta, it's not really something that's talked about. what happened. And when you listen to the podcast, you can tell where, the police did not do their job, where the case was botched, in several occasions. And Wayne Williams, listening to him, at times he comes off as if he was a serial killer, and other times he comes off as just the next door guy. I mean, like a nerd. So I made the decision, because the podcast would drop every Friday. I made the decision to listen to that particular podcast every Friday when it dropped on my way home. It wasn't something I wanted to listen to while I was sitting at work, because you don't want to miss any details of the podcast. But it's extremely, extremely intriguing. I would highly recommend it. You don't have to necessarily have been from the 80s or know of Wayne Williams. But if you don't know about Wayne Williams, look him up and listen to the podcast. Like I said, I think it's about 14 or 15 episodes. Each episode runs maybe about 50 minutes. But a great listen nonetheless, I think. Another podcast that is probably it's a weekly listen, and it's one of my favorites. Probably I don't want to rank it, but I mean, like it's up there. Is Questlove Supreme, podcast from the homie Questlove from The Roots. You got Fonte from Little Brother, he's on there. And a host of other friends. This podcast is primarily, it's a music podcast, and they talk to different either musicians, artists. They've talked to comedians, but it's really for music nerds and music fans and music, people who are really, really entrenched into music. Case in point, like they interviewed Salaam Remi, the rap producer, and I was just intrigued by his story that, it gives you like a behind the scenes look, and they talk a lot about music and how things were created and things of that nature. But Questlove Supreme, the podcast comes out every Wednesday at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they've interviewed everybody from Chris Rock to it's almost like who haven't they interviewed? Babyface, to Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, Common. Quest just did a podcast with former First Lady Michelle Obama. I mean, just about anybody that you can think of, they've interviewed them, and it's an extremely good podcast. I love it, and I love listening to it. So yeah, that's one that I would definitely recommend. Another favorite of mine. Now this one's seasonal because it's based on the TV series, but Insecurity. That's hosted by Crystal and Fran. Now, Insecurity is the podcast that coincides with the hit TV series Insecure on HBO. So really, to get this podcast, you need to be watching Insecure, the show, which is by far one of my favorite shows on network TV. And so if you're watching Insecure, you definitely want to listen to this podcast because they break it down. I mean, like it's so interesting because sometimes I will watch an episode and then I'll listen to this podcast and they will point out things that I've missed during that podcast. And the podcast is an hour long. And again, it only comes on when Insecure is on. Insecure will be heading into they just completed their third season and they'll be back for the fourth season. And the podcast Insecure, the show comes on Sunday nights and the podcast is usually out by Monday morning the following day. But I love it. It's podcast usually runs about an hour. It's a dope podcast. So if any of you fans out there who watch Insecure, you need to listen to this podcast. It's dope. Another favorite of mine, the Joe Budden podcast, featuring Joe Budden, former rapper slash reality star slash, I don't know, media mogul, culture curator, Joe Budden and his friends, Rory and Mal. Love this podcast, man. It is now, the podcast actually is now on Spotify and YouTube. It used to just be on YouTube, and you could watch it. Personally, I don't watch the YouTube show anymore because it's easier for me because I'm always moving around and stuff at work. It's easier for me to listen to it just on Spotify. But I love it, man. It's three friends, and they talk music a lot, and they talk about current events as far as what's happening or whatever with hip hop and stuff like that. But I always say, like, this podcast sounds like how it's supposed to sound if you got three friends just sitting in a room just talking. And well, I guess you can count four if you count the boy Parks. But yeah, it's funny. That podcast drops every Wednesday and every Saturday. Yeah, I love it. Joe Budden. Joe's funny. Joe's a funny guy, and I like how they get on each other. And like I said, it really reminds me of me and my boys just sitting around, just kicking it. So, I love that. Another favorite of mine, the Roden Fellows, HBCU 468. The Roden Fellows podcast is a favorite of mine because, for one, it's created by nationally renowned writer Bill Roden. I know Roden used to write for the New York Times. If you're familiar with the TV show that used to come on ESPN on Sunday mornings, the Sports Reporters, he was a black guy on there that was normally on there. Older gentleman, a legend in the game as far as writing, as far as sports writers. And he's created this podcast where he's handpicked 4 or 5 students from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and they are, budding sports broadcasters, sports journalists, sports announcers, if you will. And they get on there and they talk sports and they talk about life and, culture on a black college campus. And that, strikes me close to heart, obviously, because I am a proud alum of a historically black college, South Carolina State University. So that's a dope podcast. Another one that I've been rocking with for a long time, man, is my man Bomani Jones. He hosts his own personal podcast, The Evening Jones, where he talks about pop culture and the current events and everything. And then he also has the Bomani Jones podcast, which is his sports podcast. I listen to both of those, subscribe to both of those. Bomani, I go way back with Bomani he had a podcast, a show, but actually radio show back in the day called The Morning Jones. And that's where I found him, and been rocking with Bo ever since, man. And obviously followed him through his career at ESPN on to his TV show High Noon. But dope show, dope podcast. Both are dope podcasts. Like I said, The Evening Jones, he talks about more current events. The Bomani Jones, The Right Time with Bomani Jones is the name of his own sports podcast. And The Right Time is more, like I said, it's just strictly sports, but it's dope. It's dope. And like I said, I enjoy listening to it each week. Now, those podcasts that I mentioned, those 6 or 7 podcasts, those are the quote unquote bigger podcasts, if you will. Those are the ones that are more popular. Now let's get into some podcasts that I actually discovered this year in 2018. First up is and again, these are in no particular order. First up is the Social Introvert podcast from my man Sid Davis. This one drops every Wednesday and Thursday. Started listening to this toward the end of this year, and man, it's a really dope podcast. I like it. Sid is real cool. I don't know how he pumps out 2 podcasts a week. It's hard enough for me to do one, but Sid, he's talking about current events, a lot of music talk. Real cool, real smooth podcast. You should definitely check that out. And all of these podcasts that I'm mentioning are on most platforms where you can find podcasts for free. The only one that is not on all of the platforms is the aforementioned Questlove Supreme. That is a Pandora exclusive. It's free, but it's exclusively on Pandora. But every other podcast that you'll hear me mention, you can find them on SoundCloud, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, you name it, it's there. But yeah, Sid Davis's podcast, the Social Introvert Podcast, that's a pretty cool one. Another one that I discovered here late in the year, We Come From Bad News Podcast. That's Nazé and my man Al. We Come From Bad News is aptly named because the two gentlemen, they're from Bad News. And what I mean by bad news is Newport News, Virginia. I mean, I like this podcast a lot because both of these brothers, they bring a lot of energy. They're going to talk a little hip hop. They're going to talk a little culture and just, common sense stuff. I enjoy listening to them. Very good, very smooth podcast. Their podcast usually running time is about, from what I can tell from as long as I've been listening, probably about 45, 50 minutes. So it's nothing too long. Same for Sid Davis's podcast. His is about right about an hour. Joe Budden's podcast, I meant to tell you, Joe Budden's podcast usually runs anywhere from 2.5 to 3 hours. So for me, I'm not going to, I take that back. Between 2 and 3 hours. I've seen them go as short as 2 hours, as long as 3 hours. I'm not going to, and I guess that's probably why I don't really watch the YouTube, because I'm hardly ever someplace where I can just sit stationary and just watch, TV or watch my phone for 3 hours. But that's the running time on those. Another one that I picked up late in 2018, which is downright hilarious, is the Frocast. nappyafro.com, the Frocast podcast. My man King Germ and his wife Queen Germ, they are hilarious. They crack me up. Like I said, I found this one probably in the last 2 or 3 months, and this one's funny. Like I said, it's a husband and wife team. They talk current events. The podcast is usually about an hour long. But the time flies by fast. They keep it hot and spontaneous. And they sound like what we would call good down home Southern folks. Queen Germ has an accent, like, I don't know where she's from, but it's a deep, deep Southern accent. I have my guess as to where she's from, but I don't want to put it out there because I'm not really sure and I don't want to be wrong. But they're funny, man. I enjoy the energy and the spark that they have between the two of them. Really, really dope podcast. Again, the Frocast podcast. Definitely check them out. And then the last one that I discovered this year as well is the E and Friends podcast with my girl Erica, aka Model E. Erica normally on her podcast, she's normally talking about women's issues or from a woman's perspective, but from time to time she'll have her husband on and they'll talk. And it's a really good podcast, really, really good podcast. Her podcast usually run between 45 minutes and an hour. And I enjoy listening to those as well. So those are 4 podcasts that I came up on in 2018. Now let's flip it over to the other side. We'll talk about some of the staples, some of the ones that I listen to on a weekly basis, and that I've been listening to for a while now. Of course, before I even get started, man, I gotta shout out my man D Frierson, aka Dig Game, over at Straight Outta Low Cash. Man, what can I say? Those dudes really have been cranking out podcasts and content probably for the better part of the last 5 years, and it's always been dope. So yeah, shout out to him and Javon and the rest of the crew. Also my man Rashani over at Single Simulcast. and the new podcast venture that he has, Unbothered. I actually was on Unbothered a couple months ago, and that was really, really dope. Rashani's, man, really cool cat, and I need to get Rashani on my podcast. I have never had Rashani on my podcast because of the time difference, but those are the staples. I mean, like, they go way back. I think single simulcast has been, I want to say it's been out, man, at least 6 or 7 years. Some other favorites of mine, Back Talk podcast, with Kay, my man Mansa Ray, and C Rich. They are actually from here in Atlanta. Dope podcast. Three friends. I'm not really sure how long they've been friends, but they have the energy like they've been friends for a long time, and they're funny. They talk a lot of current events. Sometimes they talk music, but their podcast is usually between an hour and a half, but it's a really, really smooth podcast. The fellas, they give Kay a hard time, and it's always funny because she takes it. But it's really, really dope, man. I enjoy listening to them. The next podcast, what I'm trying to think of what other one, and it's always difficult when you're doing these kind of things because you don't want to forget anything. My man Manny Fresh. Oh, can't forget about Manny Fresh. Manny Fresh used to host the Technical Foul podcast, but it's now been changed to Any Given Sunday podcast. It's a sports podcast. He's going to talk sports. His podcast usually run about an hour and a half or so. But yeah, he's going to give you all the sports. He's one of the few cats that I know that really talks and gets into baseball talk, which is always dope. He likes the Mets, so, you know, kind of feel for him. But shout out to my man Manny. Manny's good people. I've been on his podcast, and he's been on mine, and I'll definitely get him on again. And then who else? Oh, can't forget about the crew. Is the mic still on? And Dead End Sports. Those are my people right there. Is the mic still on? B, Ken, Sophie, Rod, Mike Seatown, and FIFO. They have Is the Mic Still On? Usually runs that drops weekly every, I think, Wednesday, I think. But yeah, they crank them out each week. I've been on Is the Mic Still On before. I got to get back on. It's been a minute. But it's always good to get on there and kick it with my crew. And again, this is crew. So many of you who listen to this podcast probably found me initially on Dead End Sports, which is the other podcast. Dead End Sports drops usually every Wednesday. Usually every Thursday. Is the Mic Still On? Drops every Wednesday, I think. And Dead End Sports usually runs about 2 hours or so. I mean, what can I say? I was a part of Dead End Sports for so long. I hosted Dead End Sports. So that's, and you know, from time to time, I will actually get back on as my schedule permits. But if you want dope sports talk, right there, you don't need to go anywhere else. Dead End Sports got you covered. And one other staple that I listen to on a weekly basis drops every Monday. My peoples, Tactless Know-It-Alls podcast, Mia and her husband Ty. They like, I've said it before, they're like podcast cousins. They're like cousins in real life. I've actually gone to their house and politic with them and kicked it with them, and they're good. Well, I don't want to say good. They're great people. A lot of similarities, a lot of love. They're Saints fans, so, you know. But you know what? They don't give me a hard time. I don't give them a hard time. It's all love. But I'm definitely going to be back on their podcast in 2019, and they'll be on mine as well. But yeah, they talk about whatever. Their podcast usually runs right at an hour, drops every Monday. I think it's perfect for me because I listen to them on the way to work on Monday mornings. And they're consistent every week. But yeah, they're going to give you some hot shit every week without fail. So that's one of my favorites. And the other Monday staple for me is We Did That Shit. Oh man, We Did That Shit. That's Babi and Maya. They've actually been on my podcast, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But their podcast, they're going to talk a little culture, but they give you an interesting perspective on two, black women. They're cousins, but they seem a lot closer than cousins. They're more like best friends. And really two dope young ladies. And I enjoy listening to their podcast each week. You definitely want to check that out. We Did That Shit podcast. So yeah, those are the ones that I listen to pretty much on a weekly basis, every one. And I enjoy each one that I mentioned. And I think that if you want some dope stuff to listen to, give it a spin. Give each one of these podcasts a spin, and you won't walk away disappointed. I'll put it like that. I tell you what, let's take a quick commercial break. And on the other side of the break, we'll break down some of the collaborative podcasts that I did this year on the 12 Kyle podcast. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second.
When you wait forever for the cable guy, you get bored. When you get bored, you start staring out windows. When you start staring out windows, you see things you shouldn't see. When you see things you shouldn't see, you need to vanish. When you need to vanish, you fake your own death. When you fake your own death, you dye your eyebrows. And when you dye your eyebrows, you attend your own funeral as a guy named Phil Shifley. Don't attend your own funeral as a guy named Phil Shifley. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
And just like that, we are back. Once again, it's your boy 12 Kyle, the 12 Kyle podcast. And we're talking about what's in your ears, 2018. Just giving you a rundown on some of the podcasts that I listen to and rock with. And right now I'm going to break down some of the collaborative efforts that I had on the 12 Kyle podcast. 2018 actually kicked off pretty good. I actually, one of the first podcasts that I did in the new year was a collaborative effort with my homegirls, Shelly Shell and Krishna. And we talked about Foxy Brown, Kim, Lil Kim, and Lauryn Hill. First and foremost, it's always good to get Shell and Krishna on the podcast. Those two are, first and foremost, two of my closest friends that are women. And they were on when I had my radio show on the internet, the 12 radio show. They were frequent co-hosts. I mean, Shelly Shell probably co-hosted. Hell, she had some equity in the company, if you will. She was on so much. But so it was always good to get them on. So it was good to get them on the podcast for the first time. And of course, Shelly Shell and Krishna do not disappoint. And Krishna, it was interesting to hear her talk about Lil Kim, because she and Lil Kim are from the same place, and they, grew up in the same neighborhood and everything like that. So it was good to get that perspective. And then just get their perspective on, these three women in hip hop, and given the fact that Krishna and Shelly Shell are hip hop fans. So that was dope. And again, like I said, they're friends of mine. So it's always cool to get your friends on and politic ditto. Another podcast that I did earlier in the year was with Tiffany and Joanna. That one was called Are We Socially Inept? And that was really, really dope, because we got a chance to dive into, how we act socially and answer some questions. And what was interesting about that podcast that stood out was that I've known Tiffany, it's probably about 10 years now. We have not officially met physically, but I've known Tiffany for that long. And Tiffany and I we kicked around the idea, and she wrote a bunch of questions down, that she wanted to do for a podcast like 2 years ago. And with timing, we just never could lock down a time. And she was going through, moving city to city and things of that nature. She moved here to Atlanta. So we couldn't get it done. And I just happened to run across the email that she sent me, and I hit her up one day and I was like, yo, do you still want to do this podcast? And so she was like, yeah, this would be dope. And she was like, let me get my homegirl Joanna on. And so it was my first time, interacting with Joanna. She was cool as hell. And I think it came across pretty dope, man. I really enjoyed that podcast. Schedules permitting, I want to definitely get them back on because they were fun. Hopefully it won't take me and Tiffany 2 more years to get it done. But she's like family. So whenever we get it done, it's gonna be dope. Trust me when I tell you that. Another collab effort. My homegirl Janae came through for the D'Angelo podcast. That was the Voodoo versus Brown Sugar discussion. First off, one of the things that's really amazing to me about Janae was that, and Janae's been she's been like a little podcast, like a little sister on the podcast. She used to call into the Dead End Sports Show back in the day when we had a live show, and very knowledgeable. And one of the things that I didn't realize like her music knowledge was that deep. I knew she was a big music fan, but I didn't realize her music knowledge was that deep. But what was interesting was when we were recording and she mentioned, listening to Brown Sugar, the album, and she mentioned like she was 6 years old. And so I was like, damn, I really feel old because like Brown Sugar came out. I think I was in college when Brown Sugar came out. But, even though she was young, she still had a knowledge and an appreciation for the music and was able to, eloquently talk about it. And so that podcast was really, really dope, man. And I had to, without doubt, Janae will be back on the podcast. I mean, everybody who's been on the podcast before, they're going to be on again. Trust and believe that. But her music knowledge was incredible. It was really incredible, and it shined throughout the podcast. Oh man, another collab effort. D Love Hall. D Love Hall came through. I did a series. The podcast we did was called Things Men Won't Tell You About Sex, But You Need to Know. Wow, that's all I can say. Now, if you know me, D Love Hall and we've been friends since I was in like the 11th grade. He was in the 10th grade, so we grew up together. We was in each other's weddings. Godfather. He's Godfather of my son. So again, there's somebody that knows me and has known me for 30 plus years. It was crazy. That's all I'm gonna say. And so the following week, we did another collaborative joint with Shantae and Chris Renee, and that one was called Things Women Won't Tell You About Sex, But You Need to Know. Off the Chain. Shantae and I and Chris Renee, we go back to the days of our blogs. That's how we met. And when I tell you, they are two of the funniest, wildest people you ever want to be around, that's what they are. And I love them to death. They are so, and they're two of the dopest writers that I personally know. And it's funny because like every time when they write stuff, and I think I might have mentioned it on the podcast, like when they write stuff, like, and I think I'm a pretty decent writer, but when they write stuff, I'm like, damn, I wish I could write like that. And I'm never envious of anyone else's pen, but their pen game is dope. And they both have published multiple books as well. But yeah, I had them on the podcast to talk about sex, and let's just say the conversation took off and it just did not land. So that was another dope one to check out. And then I think somewhere around the middle of the year, I had D Love Hall back on to talk basketball with my man Easy Does It VA. And we talked about the Slam Magazine's 50 greatest players list. the list was a travesty. Let me start by saying that. But having D Love Hall back on, as well as Easy Does It, and Easy Does It, another cat, we literally been best friends since I was in the 7th grade. And, Godfather, my kids, just one of my best friends, period, point blank. And so it's always interesting to get people on the podcast that know you, like from day. When I say day one, these are my day ones. So it didn't even, the conversation that we had on the podcast is no different from any conversation we would have had if it would have just been the three of us on the phone talking. But we dove into the NBA 50 greatest list from Slam Magazine. And we broke it down and we gave our opinion as to, how bogus that damn list was. So check out that podcast. That was funny. What was another one? I brought Janae back on the podcast later on. I think it was around the summertime. This time Janae came through and we did part of the Versus series, Good Kid, Mad City versus To Pimp a Butterfly, both from Kendrick Lamar. That one was fun. Janae was a lot more comfortable than she was with the D'Angelo joint, but she was torn because she's a huge Kendrick Lamar fan, and she made her case for which album she thought was better. That was a dope podcast. I really enjoyed it. Both Janae and I are big Kendrick Lamar fans, as well as D'Angelo fans. So doing those two podcasts were interesting to say the least, but we had a lot of fun. So again, Janae will definitely be back on the podcast. And then I think again during the summer, part of the Versus series, did a podcast, ATLiens versus Aquemini, both from Outkast. My man Matt B came through and blessed the podcast. This one was fun. It was a lot of fun because Matt and I have had this discussion / argument like for the better part of the last 2 or 3 years. And I don't even remember how me and Matt got to that place. I think Matt started, we connected through Dead End Sports, I think, or Dead End Hip Hop. And we just started kicking it. And Matt's a young cat. And what was impressive to me, not just his knowledge, but he made some very valid points. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't mind me telling you all this, but Matt actually had just completed drug rehab, when we did that podcast. And proud to say he's been sober for, I want to say, almost a year now. And I'm happy for him. Good dude. Like I say, he's a younger cat, man, but he has his head on straight and he's clean. And, he was pushing like, yo, we need to do this podcast. We need to do this podcast. I'm like, shouldn't you be doing something else? Like cause he's from Maryland and he was out in Arizona at rehab. And he was like, no, I'm straight. I'm doing this. And, we did it, knocked it out. And, it was really, really dope. But one of the things, like I said, that came across from that podcast, more than anything else, man, I was proud of Matt. And I'm still proud of him, of his sobriety and him being able to, conquer what it is that he's conquered and, not let, it defeat him. First and foremost, he recognized that he had a problem and, he did it. And that, a lot of people can't do that, but shout out to Matt. He came through and again blessed the podcast. It was really, really dope. And we drew a lot of conversation about Aquemini and ATLiens. So if you haven't checked that one out, go check that one out as well. A lot of fun for me to do that one. Another collab, my man Keon came through and we did a podcast called The 20 Traits That Women Want in a Man. That one was really, really fun. Keon and I have been, following each other on Twitter and he, is a frequent listener. He reached out to me and said, hey, I'd love to come on the podcast. I'm like, hey, what do you want to talk about? So we kind of kicked around some subjects and, he came on, man, and did his thing. And I really, really enjoyed that podcast. Keon's in a relationship. And so we got a chance to talk about that as well as, just break down the podcast. And, it was cool. It was cool. And then, like I said, I'm looking forward to having him back on as well. Oh, before I forget, I also mentioned the ladies from We Did That Shit podcast, Babi and Maya. Had them on the podcast to talk about black women. That was so dope. Man, we had a good time. I will definitely have them back on the podcast. This was right up their alley. The conversation was really dope and free flowing. And I got a chance to kind of pick their brains a little bit to give the listeners some insight as to, what it's like to be a black woman. And, because I'm not a black woman, I don't necessarily speak from that perspective per se on this podcast. But they do so eloquently on the We Did That Shit podcast. So that was dope. That was dope to have them on. And again, I'm definitely going to have them back on again. What was another one? Oh, can't forget. Talked a little hip hop with my son, Cameron. He came on the podcast for the podcast called Your Daddy's, what was it called? Oh, Your Daddy's Hip Hop. Your Daddy's Hip Hop. And we talked about samples. We talked about, some of the music that he listens to because he's a 90s hip hop head. Doesn't really listen to the hip hop that his friends and contemporaries listen to. And at the time of the recording, he was 16 years old. So, it's always dope to, get your kids' perspective, but, to have your child listen to, some of the music that you grew up on, I think is even more doper than anything else. So I really enjoyed that. And he's already talking about coming back on the podcast. So we'll see. He's definitely going to do it. It's just, whenever we want to knock it out. And last but not least, man, one of the frequent contributors to the 12 Kyle podcast, my boy Eclectic, aka Tweet Rhymes Life, aka Eclectic, aka Mr. One Gotta Go, aka Cream Jordans, aka No Pictures on the Internet. What can I say, man? E came through on this podcast. We did one joint part of the Versus series. We did Low End Theory versus Midnight Marauders, which is both from A Tribe Called Quest. We did the Hip Hop 101, Hip Hop 102, just us politicking about hip hop and our thoughts. What else we do? Oh, we did we did a breakdown of the Slick Rick album, The Great Adventures of Slick Rick 30 Years Later. And we also did a breakdown of the Bobby Brown album, Don't Be Cruel, 30 Years Later. Man, he also has his own podcast, which is one of my favorites. He drops his podcast periodically. He's got two podcasts, the Encyclopedia Hip Hop podcast, which I'm on a lot, and the Eclectic Discussion podcast, which I'm on quite a few times as well. In fact, probably one of my favorite podcasts that we did didn't even appear on my podcast. It appeared on his, which was the college series, our college memories. And we did a part 1 and a part 2. E went to Grambling and I went to South Carolina State University. And when I tell you that might have been one of the funniest podcasts we've ever done. I listened to it the other day and I still was cracking up laughing. It was downright hilarious. But yeah, E and I, man, we talk a lot of hip hop. Sometimes we disagree. Like he has this notion that LL is the greatest of all time. He's not. He's not the GOAT. Rakim's the GOAT. But that's my man, though. That's my man. I can't tell you. We get a lot of positive feedback when we do podcasts. Somebody on Twitter said that we were like the Ghostface and Raekwon of podcasts. And I think that fits because we have that kind of chemistry. And, we just really about putting out dope shit. And that's what we do. So to say that he's going to be back on the podcast is, I mean, that's an understatement. He's always on the podcast. I mean, when is he not on the podcast? I've got, quite a few podcasts that I probably will hold off doing unless I can get him on. So, but yeah, it's always good to chop it up with my man E. He's eclectic for real. His real name is John Eclectic. And one thing that we learned in 2018 that E told you that his guns were hot and your guns were cold. But yeah, that's about it. That's the wrap up of, what was in my ear in 2018. I hope that I didn't forget anybody that I listen to on a consistent basis. If I did, please charge it to the game. Don't charge it to my heart, But it's always, kind of interesting when you start shouting people out because you will forget somebody. But yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm assuming because you listen to mine, that you'll probably be apt to listen to more. I've given you more than enough podcasts to check them out. Even if you only check out a few, check these people out and, support, because I think that's important. And it's always good to hear something different. And one thing I can say about the podcast that I listen to, everybody's different. Nobody's on, nobody sounds the same. Everybody has some different shit coming with it. And, when it's dope, it's supposed to be different. And I think the people appreciate that even more. So there it is. So that's going to do it for me. Once again, 2018 is in the books. I want to thank you all for your support. I definitely appreciate the love. And I will catch you guys in 2019. 5 Gs.